91. Zurich's Congress Hall had been built for meetings like this one, big as could be, and right down on the lakefront. Every day of this big conference, there would be speakers and display booths celebrating the emergent accomplishments. It was going to be hard to fit them all in. In fact, there would have to be some compression by nation or project type to get a proper overview of the effort. Looking at the lists of people who were coming, Mary could begin to believe that they were actually gaining some traction, making some progress. Then it was time to visit Frank. He was there in his little apartment. He told her that the doctors had determined that he had a brain tumor and had just recently identified it as a glioblastoma. "That sounds bad," Mary said. "Yes," he said. His mouth tightened. "I'm done for." "But they must have treatments?" "Average survival time from diagnosis is 18 months. But mine is already pretty big." "Why did it take so long to affect you?" "It's not hitting anything too crucial yet." She stared at him. He met her gaze unflinchingly. Finally, it was she who shook her head and looked away as she sat down at his side. He was on his apartment's little couch, looking slumped in an odd manner. She reached across the coffee table and put her hand on his knee. It was like the first moment they had met, when he had grabbed her arm and scared her, terrified her. "Turnabout fair play." "I'm sorry," she said. "It's shitty luck. You've had some really bad luck." "Yes." "Do they know why it happens?" "Not really. Genetic, maybe. They don't really know. Maybe it's too many bad thoughts." "That's what I think." "That's another bad thought." "Doesn't matter now." "I guess not." "What will you do?" "I'll take the treatments, for as long as they tell me they're helping." "Why not?" "Something might work." She was encouraged to hear him say this. That must have showed, because he shook his head very slightly, as if to warn her to give up any hopes. "Tell me about how your plans for this conference are coming," he said. And so she did. After a while she could see he was tired. "I'll come back later," she said. He shook his head. "I will," she insisted. Actually, that turned out to be hard to do. Not that she couldn't clear the time, because she could. And the safe house she was still living in was relatively nearby. Everywhere in Zurich was pretty close to everywhere else. Really, it was a compact city. Although if you had to stay off the trams and streets, moving around in cars with tinted windows, it got harder. But it wasn't the logistics. It was knowing what she would see when she got there. Frank may had never been an unguarded person, not since she had known him anyway. The blaze in his eye, the set of his jaw, he had been easy to read, ever since that first night, when violent emotions had torn across his face like electric storms. Now he was closed. He had checked out. He was waiting for his time to come, and that was hard to watch. It was how she would be if she were in his situation, she guessed, but still. She kept finding reasons not to go. But also she felt a duty to go. So eventually she would realize it had been 10 days, 2 weeks, and she would send a message. "Can I drop by?" "Sure." She would be let in by his housemates, polite but distant people, and go in to see him. He looked bloated and unwell. He would look up at her, as if to say, "See? Here I am, still fucked." She told him about what was happening, talking away nervously to keep the silence at bay. Things were happening as always. The big conference was looking good, coming soon. The Mondragon cooperative system was spreading through Europe, and it was reaching out to make connections elsewhere. Spain itself was slowest on the uptake, because in Madrid they didn't like the Basques having that much influence. But elsewhere it was catching fire. It was the latest thing, the obvious thing. Turned out each European nation had a tradition of working communally around their old commons, which had lasted until suppressed by Napoleon or other powers, but still there, if only as an idea, now put back in play. "Good," Frank said. Also, Mary went on a little nervously, the upcoming COP was going to propose a detailed refugee plan that used some of the principles of the Nansen passports of the 1920s. Some kind of global citizenship, given to all as a human right. Agreement had been signaled by all Paris signatory nations, which meant all the nations on Earth, to grant legal status to this global citizenship and share the burden equally, with the historical disparities in carbon burn factored into the current assessments of the financial and human burden going forward. Some kind of climate justice, climate equity, a coming to terms at last with the imperial colonial period and its widespread exploitation and damage, never yet compensated, and still being lived by the refugees themselves. Good, Frank said. Mary regarded him. You don't seem very opinionated today. He almost smiled. No, he thought it over. I've been losing my opinions, he concluded. They seem to be going away.
Ah.
She didn't know what to say to that. It's interesting to see what goes first, he remarked, still looking inward. I'm presuming it moves from less important to more. Seems likely. Mary didn't know what to say, how to respond. She felt foolish and helpless. She wanted to stick with him, no matter where his line of thought took him, but it was hard to know how to do that when moments like this one came. Ask questions? Speculate? Sit there silently, uncomfortably? How are you feeling? She asked.
Sick, he said. Weak.
Fucked up. You still sound like yourself, though?
Yes.
As far as I can tell. He shook his head. I can't remember what I felt like before. I'm betting I wouldn't score very high on any tests right now. He thought it over. I don't know. I can still think. But I can't think why I should. Mary shied away from understanding that, or tried to. But she couldn't. It was too obvious. A black weight in her stomach began to pull her down. She stifled a sigh. She wanted to get out of there. It was depressing. But of course it was. She hadn't come there to get cheered up, but to do some cheering up. The difficulty of that was a given. That was why she avoided coming. But since she had come, it was a duty. But what could be said? Nothing really. And he didn't really look like he expected any answer from her, or any encouraging words of any kind. He looked calm, desolate, a little sleepy. If she stayed quiet for a while, it looked like he would drop off. After which, she could slip away. He stirred. Hey, he said, I wanted to introduce you to someone who lives here. Let me see if he's in. He tapped at his phone, put it to his ear. Hey Art, can you drop by my room for a second? I'd like to introduce you to a friend of mine. Okay, good. Thanks. He put his phone down. This guy is hardly ever here, but he's one of the original co-op members, and they let him keep his room. I just met him a while ago, and I like him. He flies an airship all over the world, following wildlife corridors and wilderness areas, basically looking for animals. He takes people along with him. What, like nature tours? I think that's right, but there are only a few passengers. They do some citizen science, and the like. And he gives what he charges the passengers to the World Wildlife Fund and other groups like that. Mary tried to sound impressed. A quiet tap came at Frank's door.
Come in.
The door opened, and a slight man entered, nodded at them shyly. Balding, beaky nose, blinking pale blue eyes, looking back and forth between Frank and Mary, attending to them with a diffident gaze. Frank said, Art, this is my friend Mary Murphy. She runs the UN's Ministry for the Future here in the city. Mary, Art here is the owner and pilot of the Clipper of the Clouds, a blimp, or is it a dirigible? A dirigible, Art said with a little smile, but you can call it a blimp if you want. Many people do. Actually, airship seems to be becoming the usual term, to avoid that confusion. And you take people up to see wild animals.
Idag.
Mary and I went up to the Alps a while ago and saw a little herd of chamois and some marmots. Very nice, Art said. That must have been lovely. It was, Mary said, trying to join in. Art attended to her. Do you go up to the Alps often? Not really, she said. Not in ways I like, she didn't say. I'd like to go more. As long as it isn't to hide from assassins, she didn't say. This man seemed to be hearing her unspoken sentences, perhaps, or noticing the spaces they left in the air. He cocked his head to the side, then exchanged a few more pleasantries with Frank and pulled up Frank's schedule for helpers that week, so he could add his name. Then he nodded to Mary and slipped out the door. Frank and Mary sat there in silence. I like him, Frank said. He's a good guy. He's been helping me, and when he's here, he's always pitching in around the place. He seems shy, Mary said. Yes, I think he is. More silence. Mary said, Look, I have to go too. I'll drop by again. Next time I'll remember to bring you one of those orange slices dipped in chocolate. Ah, good. Chapter 92. Word got around one morning that we were to be released. Did you hear? Someone said, bursting into the dorm. They're letting us go. Quickly, everyone had heard the news, and then most people doubted it. Yet another camp rumor. They always flashed around at the speed of speech, word of mouth moving through the camp to full saturation within an hour, I would say. But then always the doubt. So many rumors had proved false. Almost all of them, in fact. But occasionally it was just the news, that's all. And this time there was a meeting announced for right after breakfast. Or meetings. There was nowhere in the camp that would have held everyone in it at once. So each block would have a meeting in its dining hall. Request to keep the smallest children back in the dorms, so there would be room for almost all the adults at once.
Of course it would happen this way.
No warning, ad hoc, and improvisation, just as it had been all along. They toy with us. Cage us, release us, it's all made up moment to moment. That's history. We assembled. There was a team from the camp administrators, a couple of them familiar faces, and a few more strangers. Swiss-looking. Whatever else, the meeting was real. They had said the meeting started at 11, and we had learned well that the Swiss meant what they said when it came to schedules and times. The big digital clock on the wall went from 10 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds to 11 hours, and one of our regular keepers went to the mic and said, "Hello, everybody," in English, then Guten Morgen, and then Sabah Alker. She continued in English, which I thought was odd, as about 70 or 80% of the people in this camp spoke Arabic, and about 30% of those didn't speak English. At least that was my impression. But then I got caught up in her message. They were indeed releasing us. We were to be given world citizenship, meaning we had the right to live anywhere. We were warned there would be immigration quotas for many countries, and possibly we would have to get on a waiting list for some of them. But we could do that, and the quotas for all the countries put together added up to 200% of the number of people who had been held in refugee camps for over 2 years, which was the criterion for this world citizenship. Citizenship would be in your name, non-transferable, with a global passport. Families would be waitlisted together. The requests for residency were to be coordinated all over the world, and the ones who had been in camps the longest would be the first allowed to choose. They could take their immediate families with them. The process of relocation would begin at the start of the next month. Combined with a worldwide universal job guarantee commitment and transport and settlement subsidies, everyone should end up okay. Switzerland had committed to taking twice as many people as were now being held in all the Swiss refugee camps. The housing for these new citizens had been built already or was being finished. It was distributed throughout the country, every canton taking a proportional share. The housing was to consist of apartment blocks conforming to ordinary Swiss building and housing codes. Employment would be offered according to need, the canton as employer of last resort. There was work to be done. Facilities for cooperative restaurants were already in place, ready for opening if the newcomers so desired. It was felt that food could be both a gathering place for the new residents and an outreach to the host community. So it had often been in the past. This arrangement was not quite the same as open borders, they said. Countries would still have passports and immigration quotas. The hope was that many people would want to return home. Polling showed that many refugees felt that way, and would go back home if it could be done safely. The destabilized countries that had generated the most refugees would be helped to restabilize as much and as quickly as possible. People had lots of questions, of course. That part shifted into Arabic for the most part, and other people on the stage answered, taking turns or answering when a question matched their expertise. Before it was over, I left the meeting and went to the north perimeter, full of clashing thoughts. Anywhere. What did it mean? Where would I choose? Most of us would be talking it over with family. Some of us would go back home. I could see the lure of that. Assuming it would be safe, why wouldn't you? But I didn't think it would be safe. I didn't trust any of it. Surely there had to be a catch. Surely, if this was possible, they would have done it long before. But why think that? Things change. I tried to convince myself that things change. It wasn't that easy. Do things change? I had lived the same day for 3,352 days. It seemed proof that things don't change. But of course that was wrong. Nothing stays the same, not even life in the camp. We had formed study groups, classes, sports clubs, activity groups. We had made friends. We taught the children. People had been born, people had died. People had gotten married and divorced. Life had gone on in here. It wasn't the case that things hadn't changed, that time had stopped outright. But there is change, and there is change. Looking through the fence at the mountains, hazy in the late morning light, I felt a deep stab of fear at the idea that my life might really and truly change. A big change. New people. Strangers. A new life in a new city. After such giant changes, would I still be me? Of course, I recalled the poem about how you can never escape yourself. Every place is the same because you are the one moving to that place. No doubt true. I recalled also the old notion from psychotherapy that people fear change because it can only be change for the worse, in that you turn into a different person and are therefore no longer yourself. Thus change as death. But death of habits. That's all it is, I told myself. Remember the poem, you can't help being yourself. You'll drag yourself with you all over the earth, no matter how far you flee. You can't escape yourself even if you want to. If what you fear is losing yourself, rest easy. No, the fear I was feeling was perhaps the fear that even if things changed, I would still be just as unhappy as before. Yes, that was a real fear. Well, but I was always afraid. So this was no different. Would I miss this place? The beautiful mountains, the beautiful faces.
No.
I would not miss it. This I promised myself, and it seemed like a promise I could keep. Maybe that was my form of happiness. Chapter 93. Project Slowdown had been active for a decade, and the 30 largest glaciers on the planet, all of them in Antarctica and Greenland, had seen expeditions to their crux points where wells had been melted through their ice and the meltwater under them pumped to the surface and spread to refreeze as near the pumping wells as was convenient. Our team had been involved with the Weddell Sea Area effort, which was particularly complicated, as a dispersed fan of glaciers and ice streams had fed into the Filchner ice shelf and the Ron ice shelf in a way that was difficult to deal with. The landforms under the ice resembled a half bowl, not steep enough to easily identify the places upstream where glacial input was fastest. But we had done the best we could with that and drilled 327 wells over a 5-year period, focusing on the crux points we could find and hoping for the best. It wouldn't have been possible without the navies of the United States, Russia, and England. They let a little village of their aircraft carriers freeze into the sea ice and overwinter in the Weddell Sea, and from these carriers we were able to keep the work going year-round and supply the land bases that were set on the ice of the Ron and Filchner. Fleets of helicopters kept these camps supplied and helped to move camps from drill site to drill site. Something like $10 billion was spent on the effort just in our zone alone. Such a deal, as Pete Griffin used to say. A lot of us had worked with him back in the day, and he was often remembered. All good. Only 4 deaths, including his, all from accidents, and 3 of those accidents resulting from stupid decisions, including his. The other death, weather. Pretty good. Because Antarctica will kill you fast. And none of the deaths were people on our team, although we never said that, of course. But it was a comfort, given what had happened to Pete. No one in my group wanted anything like that to happen to us. So, 10 years in Antarctica, with good work to do, and no more grant applications either. Papers got written, science got done, but mostly it was engineering the drills and pumps and dispersion technologies. There were papers to be had there too, even if it wasn't exactly what we had gone down there for. Actually, the glaciologists were getting data like never before, especially structures of ice and flow histories, and most of all, bottom studies. For sure, no one had ever had the kind of information about glacial ice/glacial bed interactions that we have now. If we had been doing that research only for its own sake, it would have taken centuries to learn what we've learned. But we had an ulterior motive, an overriding concern. So, at the end of the season, we were flown into the middle of the Recovery Glacier, where we had drilled a double line of wells 5 years before. One of the lines was reporting that all its pumps had stopped. Hello on up to a pretty dramatic campsite, on a flat section of the glacier between ice falls upstream and down, with the Shackleton Range bulking just to the north of us, forming the higher half of the glacier's sidewalls. Lateral shear at the glacier's margin was a shatter zone of turquoise seracs, so tall and violently chardéed that it looked like a zone of broken glass skyscrapers. You never get used to helo rides in Antarctica. Not even the helo pilots get used to it. Out on the flat, we went to the wells that were reported as stopped. We had drilled these long before, back at the beginning, and now it was a familiar thing to check them out. Everything looked okay on the surface, and it wasn't the monitoring system. Very quickly, the problem noticed by the automatic monitoring was confirmed pump by pump just by looking in the exit pipes and seeing nothing there. The closer to the center of the glacier the holes were, the less water they were pumping. Most were pumping nothing at all. We were moving around on skis and roped together just in case the crevasse-free route between the wells had cracked in the years since someone had been there. There were no crevasses, so we flagged the new route, then got on the snowmobiles and tested the route to be sure. No fooling around in our team. The wells were in the usual line cross-glacier. Tall pole with transponder and meteorological box, tattered red flag on top. Under that a squat orange insulated plywood box covering the wellhead, a very small shed in effect, heated by solar panels set next to it. The pipeline was lime green, crusted with gray rime. It pumped the water south, up to a hill beyond the south bank of the glacier, joining a big pipeline there, which took a feed from all the pumps in the area. We got the door to open and went into the hut covering the wellhead. Nice and warm in there. Dark even with the lights on after the glare outside. Wind keening around the sides of the thing. Nice and cozy. It had to be kept above freezing. Check the gauges. No water coming up. We opened the hatch on the well cap, fed a snake camera down the hole. The snake's reel was so big a snowmobile had to haul it here on a sled of its own. 2 kilometers of snake on one big wheel. Down went the camera. We stared at the screen. It was like doing a colonoscopy of an exceptionally simple colon. Or probably it's more like the cameras that plumbers use to check out a sewer line. No water in the hole, even 200 meters down. This was a sign something was wrong because when a hole is open from the bottom of a glacier to its top, the weight of the ice pushes water up the hole most of the way. But here we were looking far down the hole, and no water. Got to be blocked, someone said. Yes, but where? Eventually we got to the bottom of the hole. No water at any point along the way. Hey, you know what? This glacier has bottomed out. There's just no more water to pump.
So it will slow down now.
For sure.
How soon will we know? Couple years.
Although we should see it right away too. But we'll need a few years to be sure it's really happened.
Wow.
So we did it.
Yep.
There would be maintenance drilling, of course. And the glaciers would still be sliding down into the sea under their own weight, at their old slower speed. So every decade or so they would have to be re-drilled upstream a ways from the current holes. There were going to be lots of people working down here for the foreseeable future, maybe decades, maybe forever. A rather glorious prospect, we all agreed, after thawing out and getting into the dining hut, standing high on its big sled runners. Little windows on the south side of the hut gave a view of the Shackleton Range, oddly named, as he never got near this place. Possibly it was near where his proposed cross-Antarctic route would have gone, but when the Endurance got caught in the ice and crushed, all that plan had to be scrapped, and they had set about the very absorbing project of trying to survive. We toasted him that day, and promised his ghost we would try to do the same. Drop plan A when the whole thing goes smash, enact plan B, which was this: survive. You just do what you have to in an ongoing improvisation, and survive if you can. We toasted his rugged black-cliffed mountains, rearing up into the low sky south of us. We were 650 meters above sea level and ready for food and drink. Another great day in Antarctica, saving the world. Chapter 94. The 58th COP meeting of the Paris Agreement signatories, which included the 6th mandated global stocktake, concluded with a special supplementary 2-day summing up of the previous decade, and indeed the entire period of the agreement's existence, which was looking more and more like a break point in the history of both humans and the Earth itself, the start of something new. Indeed, it can never be emphasized enough how important the Paris Agreement had been. Weak though it might have been at its start, it was perhaps like the moment the tide turns, first barely perceptible, then unstoppable. The greatest turning point in human history, what some called the first big spark of planetary mind. The birth of a good Anthropocene. So the last 2 days of this meeting consisted of 1 day of people summarizing, listing, and celebrating various aspects of the positive changes made since the agreement was signed. The second day was devoted to listing and describing some of the outstanding problems they had yet to solve if they were to secure the progress inherent or promised by the things mentioned on the first day. Both were very busy days. On the first day, the day of celebration, Mary walked around the poster halls drinking them in and feeling first startled, then amazed. The big banner with the keeling curves stretching across it, with its continuous rise, then the leveling, then the recent downturn, stood over everything else like a flag. And under that, there was so much going on that she had never heard of. She felt again the power of the cognitive error called the availability heuristic, in which you feel that what is real is what you know. But there was so much more going on than any one person could know. Reality was so much bigger than the self that it was alarming to contemplate. This explained the error. One felt the vastness and shrunk in on oneself like a snail's horns, instinctively trying to protect one's mind. And yet there was no real harm in it, this contact with the larger reality. Mary tried to feel that. She stuck her horns out and took it all in. The conference halls had the look of any other scientific meeting, poster after poster describing project after project. In this case, all the posters and the various organizational tables and the panel discussions and plenary talks described good things being done. But then again, this was always true at any scientific meeting ever held. They were utopian gatherings, spaces of hope. The difference here was that together the posters were describing a global situation that no one would have believed possible even 10 years before, and 40 years ago it had looked impossible. First, powering everything in a most literal way, was the news that a lot of clean energy was being generated. Mary recalled Bob Wharton saying something to this effect many years before, back in the beginning, during that time that now seemed on the other side of a great mountain range, those invisible Alps over which there was a younger self she could barely remember. If we can generate lots of clean energy, Bob had said, lots of other good stuff becomes possible. Now they were doing that. Also, crucially, even though they were creating more energy than ever before, they were burning far less CO2 into the atmosphere, less per year than in any year since 1887. So Jevons paradox appeared to be foxed at last, not in its central point, which stated that as more energy was created, more got used, but now that it was being generated cleanly and for fewer people as the population began to drop, it didn't matter how much of it was being used. Since there was a surplus at most points of supply, most of the time, and created cleanly, they had simply outrun Jevons paradox. And where excess energy was being lost by lack of completely effective storage methods, people were finding more ways to use it while they had it, for desalination or more direct air carbon capture or seawater pumped overland into certain dry basins and so on. On and on and on it went. So clean energy, the crux of the challenge, had been met, or was being met. Then also, another great poster, the Global Footprint Network had the world working at par in relation to the Earth's bioproduction and waste intake and processing. World civilization was no longer using up more of the biosphere's renewable resources than were being replaced by natural processes. What for many years had been true only for Cuba and Costa Rica had become true everywhere. Part of this achievement was due to the half-Earth projects, though this was not yet an achieved literal reality, because well more than half the Earth was still occupied and used by humans. Nevertheless, broad swathes of each continent had been repurposed as wild land, and to a large extent emptied of people and their most disruptive structures, and left to the animals and plants. There were more wild animals alive on Earth than at any time in the past 2 centuries at least, and also there were fewer domestic beasts grown for human food, occupying far less land. Ecosystems on every continent were therefore returning to some new kind of health, just as the result of the planetary ecology doing its thing, living and dying under the sun. Most biomes were mongrels of one sort or another, but they were alive. It was also the case, though not a single poster or panel referred to it directly on this day, that the global human replacement rate was now estimated to come to about 1.8 children per woman. As a level replacement rate was hit at about 2.15 children per woman, the total human population on Earth was therefore going down, slowly but surely. The idea that there was still a demographic surge ahead of them had gone away. Demographers no longer predicted it. Some economic theorists worried that the economy couldn't handle such a diminishing population. Others welcomed the change. But all of this was so new and controversial that at this conference, they left it unspoken. It was a topic for another day. The old attack on the environmentalist movement, that it was anti-human, still had enough force to make many in the scientific community wary of speaking on the subject. It was too hot to handle. But in this case, good news. So it was mentioned pretty often. It was one of those things being spread by word of mouth. It was somewhat the same in any discussion of the recent super depression and how the social and economic disruption of that had actually been a good thing in terms of carbon burn and biosphere health. That events which had caused suffering for millions of people might be good for the rest of the planet's life was again seen as a possible anti-humanism. Best just to frame all this aspect of the general situation as managing disaster as best one could, making the best of a bad situation, etc. And in the flood of information being presented, some things were clearly being left to word of mouth, especially inferences and suppositions. Over all of it, in the most literal sense because of the banner and the air itself, the immense flux of information was often summed up well by what was being called the big index or the big number, meaning the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. This had now dropped 27 parts per million in the previous 5 years. It was down to 451 now, same as in the year 2032, and it was on a clear path to drop further, maybe even all the way to 350, the pre-industrial high point on the 280 to 350 ppm sine wave that had existed for the previous million years, marking shifts in the shape of Earth's orbit around the Sun. 350 parts per million of CO2, if they wanted that. The discussion now was how far down they wanted to take it. This was a very different kind of discussion than the one that had commanded the world's attention for the previous 40 years. In this same period, the Gini index figures for the world at large had flattened considerably. Every continent was showing improvement. The pay justice movements, the wage ratio movements, and the central bank's recommended tax plans, plus political movements everywhere supporting job guarantees and progressive taxation, sometimes under the rubric of an end to the kleptocracy of the plutocrats, as one poster put it, had had powerful effects everywhere. Setting a generous definition of a universal necessary income, guaranteeing jobs to all, and capping personal annual income at 10 times that minimum amount, as they had done in many countries, had immediately crushed Gini figures down. The EU had led the way, the US and China had followed, and then everywhere else had begun to leak their most educated young people to these flatter countries, until the countries losing educated people also instituted it. Guaranteed jobs, yes, but also universal basic services and supported social reproduction, along with infrastructure and housing construction projects, had completed the rise out of poverty at the low end of the world income scale. Capping individual income and wealth had flattened the top of the scale. Of course, many rich people had attempted to abscond to a safe haven with their riches, but currency controls and the fact that all money was now blockchained and tracked meant that all the old havens and shelters were being rooted out and eliminated. Money was now simply a number in the global banking system, so even if one shifted money into property, that property got listed with an asset price on it and then got taxed accordingly, and often therefore sold to avoid property taxes that had gone sharply progressive. Some land was surrendered in order to keep the owner solvent in the new tax regimes, which meant there was now more and more public land, defined as such and used as a commons. State-owned enterprises using a lot of big data and read plenty algorithms became less lumbering than they had been, avoiding the old bad inefficiencies, while keeping the good inefficiencies in ways that were important for resilience and justice. A whole new economics was springing up to describe and analyze these new developments, and inevitably this new kind of economics included a lot of new measuring systems, because economics was above a system of quantified ethics and political power that depended on measurement. So now people were using older instruments like the Inclusive Prosperity Index, the Genuine Progress Indicator, the UN's Human Development Index Inequality Adjusted, and the Global Footprint Index. And they were also making up many new ones as well. All these new indexes for economic health were often now amalgamated to a new comprehensive index of indexes called the Biosphere and Civilization Health Meta-Index.
For me,
the carbon coin had played its part in all of this. For a while, in its earliest days, it had looked like the creation of carbon coins would simply make the rich richer, as some of the largest fossil carbon companies declared their intention to sequester the carbon they owned and took the corresponding payout in carbon coins, and then traded most of those coins for US dollars and other currencies, and then made investments in other capital assets, in particular property, thus becoming richer than ever, as if all their future profits were going to be paid to them at once at 100 cents on the dollar, even though their assets were now stranded as toxic to the biosphere and thus to human beings. But the central banks had worked out a scheme to deal with this. The fossil fuel companies were being paid, yes, and even at par if that meant 1 carbon coin per ton of carbon sequestered, as certified by the Ministry for the Futures certification teams, just like any other entity doing the same sequestration. But payouts above a certain amount were being amortized over time and would be paid out, when the time came, at zero interest but not negative interest, and with guarantees, thus becoming a kind of bond. And then the companies were required by law and international treaty to do carbon-negative work with the initial use of the carbon coins they were given, in order to keep qualifying for their payouts, because if they merely invested in other biosphere-destroying production, especially carbon-burning production, then they wouldn't be sequestering carbon at all in the larger scheme of things. The upshot of these policy implementation decisions was that the oil companies and petrostates were being paid in proportion to their stranded assets, but over time, and only for doing carbon-negative work, as defined and measured by the Paris Agreement standards and certification teams. The young staffs of the central banks were all quite proud of this arrangement, which they had concocted over the years in an effort to save the carbon coin, and then watched as their bosses approved and implemented it. Those staff reunion parties were raucous, to the point of almost scandalizing staid old Zurich. What the success of the carbon coin meant was a huge amount of money was now going to landscape restoration, regenerative aging, reforestation, biochar and kelp beds, direct air capture and storage, and all the rest of the efforts described elsewhere in the hall. A banner over one of the rooms put it this way: "Revolution comes, not the expected one, but another, always another." The people under the banner who had put it up told Mary it was a phrase from one Mario Praz, which had been quoted by a John P. Farrell, who had then been quoted by a Christopher Palmer. They were pleased with it, these Swiss staffers. The second day, their final day, devoted to outstanding problems, was a sobering reminder that they were still in the thick of it. And yet, given what had been revealed and celebrated the day before, there was a sense in the hall that these problems, as wicked as they were impediments to a general movement, to history itself, and thus susceptible to being overwhelmed or solved piecemeal, or worked around, or put off to a later time when even more momentum would be available for deployment against them. That day's banner over the entryway proclaimed the motto, "Overcome difficulties by multiplying them." This the staffers attributed to Walter Benjamin, who apparently when he wrote it had added that this was an old dialectical maxim, though no one could find it anywhere earlier in the relevant literatures. Probably he had made it up and given it a false provenance, although someone remarked that that wouldn't have been like him, as he had been a very diligent historian and archivist. There were people trying to find the true source on the internet, but again this only demonstrated that the internet, although huge, was not even close to comprehensive when it came to the material traces of the past. A drop in the bucket, in fact. Anyway, Mary felt there were more pressing matters than finding the real source for this quote. She wandered the halls as she had the day before. Overcome obstacles by multiplying them. Easy to do. The outstanding problems were on this day being discussed, evaluated, rated, even put into a hierarchy of urgency, then compiled into an index somewhat like the Association of Atomic Scientists' minutes to midnight clock, which indeed still stood in the hallway, set at about 20 minutes to midnight, where it had been stuck for decades, making Mary wonder if it had any validity, or rather carried any weight. Stuck clocks, not the best image for a deadly serious danger. For all the most pressing dangers they faced, she felt that the clock was always ticking. But when she mentioned this to Badham, he shook his head. That atomic clock was simply saying the nuclear danger has never gone away, he said. We act like it has, but it hasn't. So it's a way of saying we are good at ignoring existential dangers. Really, it would be better to do something about that one. Shoot it in the head. You could disarm all those weapons in under 5 years. Fission materials used as energy fuel, burned down to nothing, and the residues buried. It's stupid. After that, she wandered the halls feeling that maybe she was in fact no good at trying to rate danger. The Arctic petronation still had a not-so-secret affection for climate change, for instance. Was this a danger? Recently, it had seemed that keeping the Arctic sea ice thick and robust was now Russian policy. So Mary wasn't so concerned. They had the fleet, and they would keep staining the open Arctic Ocean yellow to keep sunlight from penetrating deep into the water and cooking them all. Same with the icing drones now sent out every long dark winter night to spray the sea ice with added layers of frozen mist and seal unwanted polleners and open areas and so on. No. If the Arctic was an outstanding problem, it was at least not intractable. Russia would do its part, she judged. Down the hall, she was thrust back into the realm of nuclear weapons and nuclear waste. Badham wasn't the only one worried. There was a whole slate of panels devoted to it. Could these problematic materials be turned into nuclear power somehow, burned down to a concentrate that could be safely cached, or slung into outer space? No one could make a compelling case either way on this, Mary judged. It was indeed an outstanding problem. Then the 30 poorest countries. The bad 30, the sad 30, the weak 30. She heard all these names. These 30 included at least 10 so-called failed states, and some of those had been failed for decades, immiserating their people. Wicked problems, in the technical sense of the term, were problems that not only could not be solved, but dragged other situations down into them. They were contagious, in effect. So it seemed that these countries suffering wicked problems needed to have interventions made by their neighbor countries, meaning the whole world, in effect, to be put into regional or international receivership. But sovereignty disregarded for one nation implied it could be disregarded for any nation if the political winds blew against it. So no nation liked to tamper with sovereignty. And it was usually the prosperous old imperial powers that were insisting most strongly that the various post-colonial disasters be put back into subaltern positions, which insistence never looked good, even if the intentions were benign. The American empire had been mostly economic and undeclared, and so had never been understood or acknowledged to be an empire by Americans themselves, despite their 800 military bases around the world, and the fact that their military budget was larger than all the other nations on Earth combined. So you could get things like the Washington Consensus, in which the World Bank and the IMF and even the WTO had been used as instruments of American hegemony, forcing small poor countries to join the world as a new kind of colony, American colonies in all but name, or else suffer even worse fates. Even the Chinese with their Belt and Road Initiative and their local power in Asia were not as bad as the Americans when it came to imperial self-regard pretending to be charity, as in the structural adjustment procedures at the end of the 20th century, which had wrecked local subsistence so that entire countries could become cash crop providers for American markets. No. Mary would include American stupidity and hubris and the assumption of being the world's sole superpower as one of their outstanding problems, but there wasn't a panel or even a poster given over to that idea. No, of course not. Another word-of-mouth issue. It would take the whole world combined and coordinated to attack that problem, and of course the other countries could never agree among themselves to the extent of being very good at that, especially since most of them were beholden to the US, and more than a few bought lock, stock, and barrel. Then the continuing poisoning of the biosphere by pollution, pesticides, plastics, and other wastes and residues of civilization was growing in people's perceptions as the CO2 problem began to look like it might be receding. The biosphere was robust, sure, but taking in and processing poison was something that any living thing could only do up to a point, after which it was simply poisoned, and in trouble. Then came a hall devoted to discussing the mistreatment of women individually and collectively, often in the same countries that rated lowest in all the other categories of well-being and political representation and functionality. That was no coincidence, of course. The status of women was not just an indicator, but fundamental to the success of any culture. But many of the old forms of patriarchy were not dead, and so among the worst of the outstanding wicked problems were patriarchy and misogyny. Mary sighed as she looked in at that hall, where of course there were lots of women, and fewer men by proportion than elsewhere. In a room of 100 people, she counted 5 white men, 20 men of color. Even if it were demonstrated to be the worst problem left, still there would be few men willing to take a look that way. It wouldn't be men who solved this one, but women, laws crafted by women and rammed through by women. So, it was indeed an outstanding problem, a wicked problem indeed. Although to be categorized like that as a problem alongside pollution and nuclear arms and carbon and misgovernance and the like, it was galling. It was another aspect of the problem itself. Women as other. When would that stop, them being as they were the majority of the species by many millions? On then to other intractables. Resource issues. Women as resources, Mary thought, no, forget about that. Water. But with copious clean energy, they could desalinate. Soil. Regenerative ag was the hope there, biology itself. The biosphere generally. Loss of habitat, of safe habitat corridors, of wildlife numbers. Extinctions. Invasive biology problems. Watershed health. Insect loss, including bee loss. Where to store the CO2 they were drawing out of the atmosphere. Even with the progress made, these were still acute problems. Ocean health. They could do nothing about ocean acidification, nor the heating of the ocean that was baked in by the previous century's carbon burn, nor the deoxygenation. Thus die-offs were happening, and presumably extinctions they didn't even know about, that might have catastrophic cascading results. Ocean health would be an outstanding problem for centuries to come, and little to nothing they could do about it, except to leave big parts of the ocean, half of it at least, alone, so that its biomes and creatures could adapt as best they might. Coral reefs and beaches and coastal wetlands, of course, were also a big part of that, and almost equally beyond what humans could do to help. Stand back, get away, keep out. Maybe try fishing for plastic rather than fish, at least in the big areas left alone. Or even in the fishing zones. Set new foundations for coral reefs. And so on. It would be a wicked problem for the rest of their lives. Oh yes, it went on like that, all day and all over the Congressshall. And it didn't help that many of these problems were incommensurate, that it was offensive to have women's welfare put on the same card as the welfare of coral reefs or nuclear stockpiles. To hell with these anthologies of outstanding problems. Lists like these were in some senses useless, she felt. Perhaps better to have ended the conference the day before, with a celebration of progress they already made and were still making. That had felt good, this felt bad. Possibly the anger generated on this day could be put to use, but she wasn't sure. A lot of shocked or depressed-looking young people were wandering Congressshall, especially young women. Mary stopped some of them when they were in groups that looked as if they were talking things over, and she tried to encourage them to fight on, to go out there and kick ass, as they had been. Some nodded, some didn't. A mixed day, therefore. And then she got a call from the clinic where Frank was being helped. He had collapsed and was doing poorly. They had him in a room of his own, a small room almost filled by his hospital bed and the monitoring and life support equipment and 3 chairs. His bed was tilted so that he was sitting up. He wore a hospital gown and had an 4-port in the back of one hand, tube running up to an 4 bag on a stand. Monitor had his pulse bumping a graph, pretty fast she thought. His face was white and swollen, dark circles under his eyes. Hair cropped short. She noticed his receding hairline. He was asleep, or at least had his eyes closed, and she sat down on one of the chairs and decided not to wake him up, to wait for that. He looked ill. The instrumentation hummed. His pulse bumped the scrolling graph over his head. Faint smell of starch and sweat and soap. Ah yes, she knew this world. She sighed and sat back. Hospice, in effect. Even if they were still making efforts to save him or give him time, this was still hospice. She knew this place. The halfway house between this world and no world. It was a quiet place, much attenuated. Much had already gone away. Remaining was water, some food as fuel, which she had seen be refused, to speed the process along, also painkillers, also removal of wastes. Catheter tube running out from undersheet to a plastic bag hanging from the bed frame. She had sometimes brought music into these places, as the one thing that need not fall away, that some part of the failing mind might recognize and enjoy, or at least be distracted by. The boredom inherent in the situation was as bad for the dying person as for those visiting, or worse. Left with time to think, as in a night of insomnia that never relented. Except sleep did come. The drugs helped that and simple exhaustion. Failing functions in the brain. Sleep came in to fill the emptied spaces, and as so often in life it was a blessing, for even if one woke uneasy and unrefreshed, Some time had been passed out of awareness, out of pain. Sleep that knits the reveled sleeve of care. Not exactly, in her painfully unraveled insomniac experience, but it was a beautiful phrase nonetheless. The rocking of the vowel sounds was like the cradle itself. Shakespeare's gift for phrasing. A true poet. The great poet, erratic though the plays always seemed to her. Hit or miss shots in the dark. Garbled messes with perfect knots of tense confrontation. She recalled once in the Abbey Theatre, Falstaff and Hal confronting each other in a scene that must have lasted an hour, the two fencing with each other, enjoying the contest of wits, but with something dangerous at stake too, something deep. Their friendship, unstable on the great disparity of their situations. Maybe she and Frank had been a bit like that. That hour would never leave her. Nor this. Well, this was hospice. There was too much time to think. Let the mind roam. She could pull out her phone and read or check her mail, sure. She could listen to music on earbuds, or bring in a little speaker box if he wanted to listen too. But also, she could just sit there.
Rest. Think.
Run over in her mind the conference that had ended, and everything else. Their last hike in the Alps, those wild creatures up there living their lives. Those creatures too must die in pain, with some of their kin huddled round them seeing them out, presumably. Or just alone out there. Tatiana. Martin, the hospice he had died in. There was a tendency to range widely in these situations, she had found, as if sitting on the edge of a cliff, with a view out to the edge of the world, like at the cliffs of Maher but even higher. The sidewalk over the abyss, as Virginia Woolf had put it. Sitting on the edge of that sidewalk with one's feet kicking in the empty air, staring down into the abyss or out at the horizon, or back at the sidewalk that had seemed so important as they walked it, now revealed as a gossamer strip through careless air. No, life, what was it? So deep and important and full of feeling, so crucial, then suddenly just a blink, a mayfly moment and gone. Nothing really in the grander scheme, and no grander scheme either.
No.
A vertiginous perch, the bedside chair in a hospice. Certainly, it was impossible to avoid the realization that this was going to happen to her too, someday. Usually one could dodge that thought. It was a distant thing. One could avoid thinking of it. Take it on, get used to it in small theoretical doses, forget about it again. Live on as if that would always be the case. But in a room like this one, the real situation obtruded, as if out of another dimension. Thus the vertigo, the sense of scale. A great reckoning in a little room. Indeed. This phrase was supposed to be Shakespeare's reference to Marlowe's death, which was generally understood to have resulted from a drunken fight over a pub bill. Sudden and stupid eruption of hospice reality into mundane reality. That first visit right after the conference, he never woke. She left with a little guilty sensation of relief. She knew very well it would be hard to talk with him in any comfortable way. He had not ever been one for mincing words or papering over a situation with some kind of comforting nostrum. He had not ever been comfortable with her visiting him. It had been like punishing him, and she had done it anyway. The next time she visited, she found his ex-partner and her child in the room. The girl was now a young woman and looked miserable. Youth was no protection from the exposure of a room like this. Indeed, for youth it might even have more of an impact, being perhaps new, or at least unusual. The calluses had not yet formed. The reality of death was more shocking, less buffered. His ex looked unhappy as well. They sat on the chairs upright, twisting their hands together, looking anywhere but at him. He regarded them with what Mary thought was a kindly look, full of regret and love. Seeing it was like a needle stuck in her heart. She had thought he was beyond feeling, that he had dismissed them somehow. But of course not. A mammal never forgets a hurt, and they all were mammals. And here these two were. They were afraid of him, she saw. Not just afraid of death, but of him. She wasn't sure he saw that. Maybe he did, and loved them for coming anyway. The young woman would remember this for the rest of her life. All her anger would have to include this too. The one who lives longest wins. But then has to carry the burden of that victory, that horrid feeling of triumph. It would never be good to feel that. "I'll come back later," Mary said. "We were just leaving," the mother said. The daughter nodded gratefully. We were just leaving. He may be tired. Frank's little smile belied that, Mary thought. Thanks for coming, he said. I appreciate it. I'm sorry you had to come. Sorry for everything, you know. No, the woman said, tears spilling down her cheeks all of a sudden. We'll come back again. It's not far. Thank you, Frank said. He reached out a hand and she took it and squeezed it. Then his daughter lunged forward and put her hand on the back of her mother's. For a moment they held hands like that. Then the young woman rushed out of the room and, weeping, the mother followed. Sorry about that, Mary said to Frank. I didn't mean to intrude. That's all right. They wanted to leave.
No.
It's all right. They were here a while. I can come back later. Not necessary. Sit for a while if you want. Maybe you could hit the nurse button. I'd like to get them to bring some juice.
Sure.
They sat there in silence. After a while a nurse came by with apple juice in a small cup with a sealed cap and a straw protruding from it. Hospital equipment, disabled people accommodated as well as could be, he drained it in a single suck. I can probably find a water fountain and refill that, Mary offered.
Please.
She wandered the hall, found a water fountain near the restrooms. Sealed cap hard to get off, but she could do it. Cup too small. Trying to keep patients from choking from overhydrating? She didn't get it. She dragged her heels getting back to the room, but there was no avoiding it. Back on the chair. He avoided meeting her eye, she thought. She would have to exert herself to make this work. We had a good meeting, she said.
Yeah? Tell me about it. So she did.
It was interesting to try to summarize the whole event in a way he would appreciate. The day of accomplishments, the day of outstanding problems. The difficulty in reconciling the two. The difficulty in giving up any sense of influence on the process, much less control. When you ride a tiger, it's hard to get off. The Chinese had known this feeling for a long time. How were the Chinese? He asked, curious. Are they on board with all this? Yes, I think so. I get the impression that they feel confident they're at the center of the story, or one of the main players. For them, it's not just the United States anymore. They have rivalries with Russia and India that are also collaborations. They have contacts everywhere. I think they know they're crucial. I don't see the party beating the drum about the century of humiliation anymore, or not as much. It doesn't make sense to the Chinese alive now, including the leadership. So they seem to be relaxing into a feeling of confidence, of being taken seriously. No one can bully them anymore, not even the US. It would be stupid to try. And they can see that everyone's beginning to do things more like them. I mean state-owned enterprises. Everyone's taking over money and energy and even land. They're all seen as public trusts now, and that's how the Chinese have always treated them. So the containment of the market, of finance, they must feel they led the way on that, or gave everyone an example of how to do it. So it's really America that is the main problem, Frank said. Mary sighed. I suppose. It's so easy to blame you for everything. You lead with your chin, but I'm never comfortable with that. There's so much good along with the bad. The country of countries, that kind of thing. I wonder if people said that about Britain when it was the world power.
I don't know.
Not in Ireland. Well, that's true. She laughed. Although it has to be said, there was some good in the Brits and their empire, even in Ireland. I bet you don't say that when you're there. No, I don't. Suddenly, he winced. His forehead popped sweat. Are you all right? She asked.
He didn't reply.
He buzzed the nurse, which was a reply of sorts. When one showed up, he asked her for pain relief. Mary felt her stomach clench. Of course.
Pain.
Enough to cause sweat to pop out of you, to cause your face to go gray. Breakout pain, they called it. She had seen this before, but had been a long time. Maybe I'll come back later, she said. Okay, he said. Chapter 95.
I am a thing.
I am alive, and I am dead. I am conscious and unconscious. Sentient but not. A multiplicity and a whole. A polity of some sextillions of citizens. I spiral a god that is not a god, and I am not a god. I am not a mother, though I am many mothers. I keep you alive. I will kill you someday, or I won't and something else will, and then, either way, I will take you in. Someday soon. You know what I am. Now find me out.